In a small town, a horrifying crime unfolds. A happy family shattered by a shocking incident. They lived an exemplary life until one fateful morning. The police received 2 distress calls, and what they encountered was straight out of a detective thriller. For 7 long years, the truth remained hidden, and the case became a mystery that captivated an entire town. Suspicion falls on the victim's husband, but he maintains his innocence. Can the truth be unraveled? Honey DeBate was born on July 31, 1976, in a small American town of Ellington, Connecticut. She had 2 sisters and a brother. From an early age, Connie stood out for her kindness and desire to help people, which earned her many friends. Later on, fueled by these qualities, Connie decided to pursue a medical education. She studied at the University of Connecticut and then found employment in the sales department of a pharmaceutical company. In addition to her career, Connie became the vice president of a charitable organization in her town, which provided free emergency medical assistance to people. She also desired to create a large and close-knit family. In the early 2000s, an opportunity presented itself when she met a man named Richard, and a romance blossomed between them. The couple got married on July 4, 2003, and a few years later, they had a son. 3 years after that, their second son arrived. Around the same time, Connie and Richard decided to move into a new home, purchasing a large house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington. It was an ideal choice for their expanding family, with a spacious house and a large backyard where their sons could play. Moreover, their close friends lived in the same area, and they frequently spent time together as families. For many years, they led an exemplary life. However, everything changed on December 23, 2015. That morning, the police department received 2 calls in quick succession. First, the security company alerted them that the alarm had gone off at Richard and Connie's house. 5 minutes later, Richard himself called the police, requesting assistance. The officers promptly arrived at the house only to be greeted by a horrifying sight. One of them entered through the open front door and immediately noticed a trail of blood leading from the staircase in the basement to the kitchen. Following the trail, the officer discovered Richard in the kitchen. The man was partially tied to an overturned chair with zip ties, lying face down on the floor with wounds visible on his body and another plastic restraint around his neck. The officer called out to him, and Richard replied with a single sentence, "He's still in the house." The police immediately requested backup and began searching both the building and the entire neighborhood. Soon after, they made another horrifying discovery as they descended to the basement. They found Connie's lifeless body with a gun lying next to her. Meanwhile, detectives freed Richard, and while they waited for an ambulance, he recounted what had happened that morning. At around 8:10 a.m., Richard had taken their sons to the bus stop from where they would go to school. Afterward, he returned home, changed into his office attire, got into his car, and headed to work. Meanwhile, Connie was preparing for a sports activity taking place at the local charity organization's gymnasium. Shortly after Richard left home, he received a notification from the security service about an alarm triggered at their house. This had happened before due to their cat, whom they often left home alone. Richard also realized that he had forgotten to take his laptop, which he needed for work. Therefore, he decided to turn back. Before turning around, he messaged his boss, informing them that he would be delayed, and then drove back home. Richard arrived at the house sometime between 8:45 a.m. and 9 a.m. Upon entering, he heard a noise on the second floor. As he went upstairs and entered his and Connie's bedroom, to his horror, he saw an unknown man rummaging through the closet. The intruder was dressed in camouflage clothing with his face covered. As soon as the perpetrator noticed Richard, he lunged at him, knocking him to the floor. The assailant demanded Richard's wallet, bank cards, and their PIN codes. Otherwise, he threatened to wait for his family and kill them. Almost immediately after that, Richard heard the garage door open, indicating that Connie had returned from her activity earlier than expected. He shouted that there was someone in the house and told her to run. The intruder had it downstairs, but Richard attempted to stop him. During the struggle, the unknown man managed to push Richard off the stairs, and he fell to the first floor. While he was regaining his senses, Connie ran to the basement where they kept 2 handguns, and the assailant pursued her. A few moments later, Richard managed to stand up and followed to the basement. However, by the time he reached there, the unknown man already had the gun, and in the next second, he shot Connie. The sound of the gunshot was so loud that Richard was almost deafened for a few minutes. He thought he heard a second shot shortly after, but wasn't certain. Afterward, the assailant made Richard sit on a chair and bound his hand and leg with plastic restraints. Then he put down the gun, picked up some tools lying in the basement, and inflicted several puncture wounds on Richard with them. Following that, the unknown man knocked over some items, took a blowtorch, and began burning them. Apparently, by using the blowtorch, the intruder attempted to eliminate evidence. Afterward, he turned to Richard and directed the torch toward him. Due to being only partially restrained to the chair, Richard managed to stand up and knock the torch out of the assailant's hands. He grabbed it and directed it toward the attacker, setting fire to the mask on his face. The unarmed perpetrator immediately fled the basement, and shortly after, Richard went upstairs to call the police. While Richard was recounting the incident, the police thoroughly searched the house and an area several kilometers around it. However, they failed to find the suspect. The only thing they discovered was Richard's wallet, which was lying on the lawn in front of the house. Investigators called in canine units with search dogs in an attempt to track the killer. They allowed the dogs to sniff the wallet as the perpetrator had held it for some time. However, it didn't work, and 3 different dogs kept leading the detectives back to Richard. Following that, the canines were taken through the house, hoping they would detect the scent of an intruder, but that also yielded no results. Detectives found it strange because trained dogs are usually capable of detecting human presence even days later. But in this case, none of the 3 dogs picked up anything. Another peculiar aspect was the timeline of the incident. According to Richard, approximately 5 minutes had passed between the moment he entered the house and when the assailant fled. Considering that Richard returned home between 8:40 a.m. and 9 a.m., everything should have ended no later than 9:05 a.m. However, the security company only reported the alarm activation at 10:16 a.m., and Richard himself called the police a few minutes later. It seemed that he had spent over an hour in the house before contacting the police. Additionally, there was too little time between Connie's departure for her sports activity and her return. Meanwhile, Richard was taken to the hospital where doctors determined that his injuries were not life-threatening. Their detectives interviewed him again, hoping to obtain a description of the attacker. Richard stated that the intruder was tall and well-built, but his face was impossible to see due to the mask. Forensic experts examined Connie's body and found that she had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one in the abdomen and another in the back of the head. The detectives had very few leads, and they continued to talk to Richard, hoping to gather more details. The more questions they asked, the more suspicious his answers became. Initially, Richard claimed that he had left for work while Connie was getting ready for her training session, but in the hospital, he stated that he couldn't recall with certainty who had left first. He also couldn't remember if he had activated the alarm before leaving or if his wife had done it. Richard also changed his version of events. Initially, he claimed to have heard a noise on the 2nd floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he stated that there was no noise and he only noticed the intruder when he went upstairs and entered the bedroom. He also said that the assailant didn't push him down the stairs from the 2nd floor, but rather he tripped and fell himself. However, the main inconsistency was regarding the moment of the murder. Richard stated that he rushed into the basement and witnessed the assailant taking the gun from Connie before shooting her. However, initially, he claimed to be unaware of how the attacker acquired the weapon. Furthermore, according to Richard, the basement was pitch dark, leading the detectives to wonder how he could see what was happening. Then Richard also added that he couldn't see Connie's body due to the darkness, so he wasn't certain if his wife was dead. Another suspicious element was the superficial wounds inflicted on Richard with pliers. They posed no real threat, but the interesting part was that most of them were on the left side of his torso, considering that Richard was right-handed and his right hand was not restrained to the chair. he could have self-inflicted those wounds. Additionally, there were no bruises or contusions on his body. According to Richard, he fought with the assailant and fell down the stairs, which should have resulted in abrasions, but there were none. Richard's shorts had blood stains, but forensic analysts found inconsistencies with his story. If someone had inflicted wounds on him with a sharp object while he was sitting on the chair, at least a few drops of blood should have landed on the lower part of the shorts, but there were no traces there. The same applied to the area in the basement where the assailant struck Richard with pliers. There should have been a considerable amount of blood on the floor near the chair, but the investigators found only a few small droplets. That wasn't all. According to Richard, after the attacker fled, he regained consciousness after a while and then crawled up the stairs from the basement to the first floor. However, there was not a single trace of blood on the steps, even though Richard was injured and should have been bleeding. Another peculiar detail caught the attention of the detectives while examining the crime scene. They noticed that the basement window was open. The police considered the possibility that the intruder entered the house through that window, but there was an interesting point: the locks had been removed from the inside. The same was true for another window, and the investigators decided to conduct a small experiment. They attempted to open it from the outside, but they succeeded only when one of the officers struck the frame and shattered the glass. This led the detectives to doubt that the intruder could have opened the window even without the locks without breaking the glass. All these factors made the investigators question the authenticity of Richard's story. They went back to him at the hospital and asked if they had any problems in their marriage, to which he stated that he had a mistress, but Connie was aware of it. According to his account, he and his wife wanted to have a third child, but Connie was unable to conceive. That's when Richard proposed the idea of surrogacy, and he chose his former classmate as the surrogate mother. She had recently gone through a divorce and wanted to have a child. Richard and his wife presented her with a plan: she would conceive Richard's child, and then the three of them would raise the baby together, and the woman agreed. Initially, they planned to proceed with medical fertilization procedures, but it turned out to be too expensive, so they decided to do it in a more natural way, and Richard engaged in intimate relations with the woman, resulting in her pregnancy. He claimed that Connie was completely okay with the arrangement and supported everything that was happening. The detectives had serious doubts about the credibility of this story, as it sounded highly unnatural. They continued to question Richard, and his account changed once again. Just a few minutes after telling the story, he stated that, in fact, Connie and his friend never met or spoke to each other. He also admitted that he wasn't sure if his wife knew about the pregnancy. During further conversation with the police, he confessed that he had been cheating on his wife with his former classmate for several years, and Connie was unaware of it. The detectives reached out to the woman, and she stated that she entered into a romantic relationship with Richard less than a year ago. She knew he was married but believed he was in the process of getting a divorce, as he had told her so. The woman became pregnant in June, 6 months before the incident occurred. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer for the divorce and planned to finalize the process before the baby's birth. However, investigators found out that he hadn't contacted any lawyer, and all of Connie's acquaintances confirmed that she never mentioned anything about a divorce. All of this was enough for the detectives to consider Richard as the main suspect. However, they couldn't find any substantial evidence against him, so the police started considering all possible scenarios. That's when they discovered something interesting. Friends and relatives of the family informed them that Connie had repeatedly complained about a contractor with whom they had issues. He had done poor quality work on their house, and the couple tried to get a refund, but the contractor turned out to be quite aggressive. Connie admitted that she was genuinely afraid of him. It was because of this issue that Richard and Connie purchased 2 guns and installed an alarm system. Investigators looked into the contractor, but he had an indisputable alibi for the time of the murder. Eventually, they returned to their prime suspect, the victim's husband. For months, the police had refrained from publicly declaring him a possible murderer. All of Connie's friends and relatives believed that an unknown robber was behind the crime and sympathized with Richard. Detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that if she had discovered her husband's infidelity, especially that his mistress had become pregnant, she would have undoubtedly confided in them. Other acquaintances of the family noted that Richard had been behaving strangely after the murder. He didn't appear depressed or upset, and a few days after his wife's death, he even asked a few neighbors, "Where do you usually order food from?" Digging deeper, the police discovered that Connie and Richard were facing serious financial problems. Connie was unaware of where their money was going, while Richard secretly spent it on his mistress. They also found a note titled, "Why I Want a Divorce" on her smartphone. In the note, she listed Richard's constant lies, mistreatment of her and the children, his unauthorized use of her money, and more. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie had been contemplating ending the marriage, but she had no idea about her husband's secret life. Further examination of the financial aspect revealed that just 5 days after the murder, Richard attempted to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account, but the request was rejected by the security service. A month later, he received a $75,000 check from his wife's employer. All of this indicated that Richard may have had selfish motives for the murder, but it didn't prove his guilt. Another curious fact was that Richard canceled the contract with the security company only 19 days after the murder. If his story about the intruder was true, it would have been the most illogical move, endangering not only himself but also his 2 sons. Desperate to find any evidence, the detectives obtained a search warrant for all electronic devices in the house, and finally, they stumbled upon something significant. Collecting all this information together, the police were able to reconstruct the exact timeline of events. At 8:44 a.m. in the morning, the security system recorded the garage door opening and closing. Investigators determined that Connie had left for her workout because at 8:53 a.m. she was captured on camera near the gym. At 8:50 a.m., Richard, who was still at home at that time, first deactivated the alarm system and then reactivated it. After that, he was supposed to leave the house and go to work, but at 8:59 a.m., he again disabled the alarm using his remote control. Considering that the remote control works within a few meters of the system, Richard had to return home, which aligned with his claim that he went back to retrieve his laptop. However, there is one problem. He stated that he received a notification of the alarm being triggered on his way to work. During that time frame, though, the security system did not record any breaches, indicating that he didn't receive any notifications. At 9:02 a.m., Richard accessed his email from a tablet, and 2 minutes later, he wrote to his boss that he would be delayed because his alarm had gone off. Another inconsistency emerged here. Not only were there no actual alarm notifications, but Richard also lied to the police in his email. He claimed to have sent it immediately after receiving the notification while being several kilometers away from home, but the tablet data showed that he was at home when he sent the email since it was connected to the home Wi-Fi. It appeared that he spent a minimum of 4 minutes inside the house before he supposedly encountered the intruder, and everything that happened thereafter took less than a minute, which was theoretically impossible. However, the crucial evidence came from Connie's fitness tracker. She arrived at the gym at 8:53 a.m. but left a few minutes later because the classes were canceled. At 9:08 a.m., the bracelet stopped tracking steps. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie got into her car and drove home. The journey took 8 minutes. Here is where it gets interesting. According to Richard, the assailant attacked his wife almost immediately after she entered the house. But the bracelet data contradicted this. The data showed that the woman walked 370 meters inside her house between 9:18 a.m. and 10:17 a.m. in the morning. Data from her social media account also showed that she was online for 6 minutes during this time frame. This means that Connie entered the house at 9:18 a.m. and was alive for nearly a whole hour, completely contradicting her husband's story. The crucial factor here was that the police had not just theoretical inconsistencies, but full-fledged digital evidence to support their case. Gathering this detailed information took the police over a year, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event was a real shock. They had no idea what evidence the police had managed to gather and continued to see Richard as the victim. The man was accused of murder, and initially, the bail amount set for him was $5 million. However, his lawyer argued that Richard had a clean criminal record and 2 minor sons under his care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million, which he promptly paid. Richard spent a whole 5 years waiting for trial as the process kept getting postponed. The trial finally began in April 2022, and during this time, the man's lawyers managed to gather many interesting facts. The defense presented evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown individual were found in the house. They also pointed out that there was only a minimal amount of gunpowder on Richard's hands, and if he had been the one who fired the gun, there should have been much more. The prosecution refuted these arguments, stating that the gunpowder test was conducted several hours after the man was taken to the hospital, giving Richard ample time to remove most of the traces. Regarding the DNA, there was no evidence to prove that it belonged specifically to the mysterious intruder. Anyone who had visited Richard and Connie's house at least once could have left those samples. In turn, the prosecution presented a detailed digital timeline of the couple's movements that morning, contradicting all of Richard's statements. The evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unknown intruder, as she continued moving around the house and using social media without any indication of distress. Richard's own story became a significant argument for the prosecution as he repeatedly changed his statements. All the contradictions in his words were used as further evidence of his deceitful storytelling. The trial lasted for 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, the jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison, but he continued to insist on his innocence. This trial was a difficult ordeal for Connie's relatives and loved ones, as they only learned about all the evidence against her husband during the process. Until that point, many of them still believed in the story of the unknown robber. But once all the cards were laid out on the table, no one doubted Richard's guilt anymore. However, his lawyers announced plans to appeal the verdict until it was reviewed, but so far, these attempts have not yielded the desired result. As for Connie's sons, they remained in the custody of her relatives. At the time of the murder, they were 6 and 9 years old, but the children lived with their father until the verdict was reached. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.
This gruesome story that took place in England over the years has become one of the most famous criminal cases in the country. A young woman was killed while walking in the park with her 2-year-old son, who was the only witness. The police couldn't find the perpetrator for 16 years, and when the case was finally solved, they were accused of catastrophic mishandling. It turned out they had committed numerous mistakes that cost the lives of many people. In this video, we will show you how a single murder case evolved into something much larger over 16 years and how it all came to an end. Was born on November 23, 1968, in a village near Colchester, England. She grew up in a decent full family. Her father was an army officer, and her mother was a housewife. From an early age, the young woman took part in various volunteer programs helping the elderly and children with disabilities. At age 11, she enrolled at Colchester High School for Girls, where she was active in dance, singing, and acting. All of her teachers insisted that the young woman had real talent and should develop in that direction. However, Rachel herself was more deeply into the study of history and English. After school, she got a job as a lifeguard at the pool in Richmond. Rachel later planned to try her hand at hosting a television program for children in 1988 when she was 20 years old. Rachel met her future husband, Andre. The couple began dating, and a year later, they had a son, Alex, together. They moved to an area of London called Belham. By then, she had already been offered a job as a model, but she decided to devote her full attention to her family for a few years and then tried to get a job in television. On a summer morning, July 15, 1992, Rachel took her son and their Labrador for a walk in the local park. At the time, Alex was only a month away from his 3rd birthday. This park in Wimbledon's Common neighborhood was popular with the locals. There were always a lot of people there during the daytime, mostly parents with children and dog walkers. Despite this, because of the large area and the abundance of greenery, it was always possible to get away from prying eyes and enjoying nature and solitude. Unfortunately, there was a downside to this. At about 10:06 a.m., a woman walking in the park noticed a gruesome scene. A young woman was lying on the ground. There was a lot of blood around, and a small child was sitting next to her. The victim was Rachel. Several dozen police officers arrived on the scene. They had to cordon off an area of 4 square kilometers where there were hundreds of potential witnesses and possibly the killer. Detectives soon realized that none of the park's visitors had seen either the moment of the attack or the killer himself. No one except for one witness, Rachel's son Alex. They were to get all the information from the 2-year-old boy. Of course, this was extremely difficult to do. The child was first admitted to the hospital for examination to make sure he was not injured. Later, the detectives did get some information from him. He said he and his mother were approached by a tall, thin white man with brown hair. Everyone in the park was questioned. It took the police almost an entire day, but it only took a few hours for reporters to get the whole country to hear about this gruesome crime. Rachel's case instantly caused a wide resonance, which is not surprising. A young mother died in front of her child in one of the most popular parks in London. Residents of Britain were even more shocked when the newspaper leaked information from the pathologist's report. Rachel had been stabbed 49 times with a sharp object. There was enormous pressure on the Metropolitan Police. Society demanded that the sadists be caught and punished as quickly as possible, and detectives did indeed have to work at an accelerated pace. In the first few weeks, they interviewed 548 men, 32 of whom were even arrested for a short period of time. But all to no avail. The police simply had no leads. The only thing the experts were able to find was a tiny piece of organic material that they thought might be connected to the killer. But in 1992, technology simply didn't allow them to study it. By September, investigators were left with no suspects, so they enlisted the help of Paul Britton, a renowned profiler, to compile a description of the killer. Here's what he came up with. He is a man in his late 20s to early 30s, most likely living alone. All of his hobbies are also socially unrelated. He's interested in knives and the occult and has sadistic fantasies. In addition, he lives near the park at the request of the police department. This profile, along with this catch, was shown on television. After that, they received at least 4 calls, all with the same matching name, Colin Francis Stagg. In addition to the fact that he fit the sketch, the police ran his name and realized that he had already been on their radar. The fact is that the stag had tried to enter the park the day Rachel was killed. Colin Stagg, 27, had led a secluded lifestyle. He had lost his job and was struggling to find money to pay for housing and food. He had a dog that he walked every morning in Wimbledon Common Park. According to his testimony, on the day Rachel was killed, he went there with his dog, but because of a severe headache, he quickly went home and went to bed. Toward evening, he felt better and decided to take his dog out for a walk again. However, on this approach to the park, he was stopped by the police. Stagg calmly answered all questions and gave his details. The police had no evidence against Stagg, but he seemed to them to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. In addition, the press kept pressuring law enforcement agencies, and they needed a breakthrough in the case urgently. That same day, Stagg was brought to the police station where he was held for 3 days. When questioned, he denied any involvement in the murder, but the detectives were beginning to believe more and more the opposite. First, occult books were found in his home, which coincided with the profiler's suggestion. Second, the police were able to find 2 women who gave some disturbing details about Stagg. One woman accused him of exposing himself in front of her in that very part. In his defense, Collins said he was just sunbathing in a secluded part of the park, and the woman came there herself. Another woman reported that she had been exchanging intimate letters with him for some time in one of them, and he confessed to her that he dreamed of having sexual intercourse outdoors. All this was already enough for the police to consider Colin a pervert and finally believe his involvement in the murder of Rachel, except they knew that all these circumstantial arguments would not stand a chance in court. For this reason, the man had to be released on the advice of his lawyer. He agreed to pay a fine for exposing himself to a woman in the park, though he continued to insist on his innocence. Detectives, along with a profiler, came up with a very unusual plan that was supposed to help force a confession. a Metropolitan Police officer under the pseudonym Lizzie James began writing column letters of intimate content. She said she knew the woman Stake had corresponded with before. Despite the ridiculousness of the situation, the plan worked. Colin responded to all the letters, and each time their dialogues became more and more explicit and perverted. Lizzie played the part of a woman with violent and sadist hobbies, sometimes even illegal, and their communication lasted 5 months. All this time, Stagg insisted that they finally meet in person, and the detectives decided it might actually help to get a confession out. The location and date was set at a park. Lizzie didn't go there alone, but Stagg didn't know that plainclothes officers were keeping an eye on them in case the man decided to attack their colleague during the conversation. Izzy, on the provider's advice, shared with Colin a fictional story about her secret hobbies. She revealed that her ex-boyfriend was into the occult and that they performed a ritual sacrifice on a living person together. Stagg took this information rather calmly. At least he kept in touch with Lizzie, and they spent a few more hours together and parted ways. After that, they met a few more times, and finally, the police decided to move on to the final part. Walking in the park, Lizzie talked to Colin about Rachel's murder. She told him that she wished he had been the murderer because she was aroused by thoughts of the crime, but it didn't work. Stagg apologized to her and told her that he had nothing to do with the murder. Lizzie tried to get him to confess several more times, but he kept denying his involvement. It looked as if the police had botched a 6-month operation. They couldn't get any evidence that Stake had killed Rachel, but the detectives were still convinced they were right. That's why they did arrest him in August 1993. At the interrogation, Colin was told all the cards and that all this time, he had been in correspondence with a police officer. He read excerpts from these letters describing various perversions and was also introduced to the real Lizzie herself. Stagg was shocked, but, on the advice of his lawyer, refused to answer police questions. Investigators had hoped to the last that, under such pressure, he would confess to the murder, but he did not. All they had to do now was to take the case to trial. All this dragged down for a year, which Stake spent in custody. When the case finally went to trial, his lawyers blew the prosecution's arguments to smithereens. Even the judge was forced to admit that the whole operation with Lizzie James was overkill and that the police had behaved in an extremely unprofessional manner. In September 1994, Colin was acquitted of all charges and released. Lizzie James later resigned from the police, citing serious psychological trauma from the operation. The police, who had spent more than £3 million on this investigation, were deadlocked. They had not a single suspect, and most of the detectives continued to think the Stake was the murderer. And they were not alone in this opinion. The newspapers and the public continued to blame him for what happened. Every time he went out on the street, he caught the embittered looks of passersby. Almost the entire country believed that the murderer had gotten away with it, and this only added to the hatred towards Stagg. This went on for years. The Rachel Nichol case was finally hung in the balance, and the police made little effort to look for new suspects. Why, when they were all sure of Colin's involvement by then, Rachel's husband, along with Alex, had gone to live in Europe for several reasons. First, he was constantly harassed by journalists, which reminded his son of his mother's murder. Secondly, the father felt it was not safe for his son to remain in London. He was the only person who had seen the murderer for a long time. No one knew which country they had moved to. Later, journalists did get wind that they lived in Spain and France. In 2000, Scotland Yard took up the case and assigned a new team to it. They studied all the collected material and witness statements, but they failed to find a new suspect. Only 3 years later, they announced that they had found DNA from an unknown man, and Rachel's clothes analysis technology had only just matured to such a capability. And in 1992, such a discovery was simply impossible. Even in 2003, this tiny sample, which took experts 18 months to find, was not enough to establish identity. The data from that sample was only enough to rule out unsuitable people, and a year later, in 2004, the police finally had a new suspect. His DNA was already in the database, and a comparison with a sample from Rachel's clothes showed mixed results. That man was the 38-year-old Robert Napper, a convicted murderer and serial rapist who, at the time, had already spent 10 years in a halfway house. His biography is striking in two ways: the cruelty of his crimes and the ease with which he evaded justice later. Because of this, the police would face a wave of outrage from the public. Napper first came into the hands of law enforcement in 1986. He was then given a suspended sentence for assault with an airgun. In 1989, he broke into a young mother's house and abused her. For the next 4 years, there was a series of similar attacks, but the police did not tie them together and could not reach the suspect. What followed was something truly amazing. Napper confessed to his mother that he had carried out all these attacks. She called the police and told them everything. And what do you think? They found no connection between the crimes and the woman's story, so they didn't look into the Napper's involvement. The only thing the mother could do was convince her son to see a psychiatrist. When Napper came back from there, he said that the specialist thought he was crazy but took no further action. A short time later, he assaulted and abused a woman and her child in Crystal Palace Park. This happened just weeks before Rachel's murder. But again, the police failed to see the connection. This was by no means the only such attack in Crystal Palace Park, and police at some point figured out that one man was committing the crimes from the words of witnesses. They compiled a sketch of him. After the publication in the newspapers, several of Napper's neighbors contacted the detectives. They all pointed to the man, and the police called Napper for a blood sample. He simply ignored the request, and the detectives did not go looking for him. They simply forgot about him. In November 1993, London was rocked by another high-profile crime which, as it later turned out, was also committed by Napper, a young mother, Samantha Bissett, who was attacked in her room. In addition, the perpetrator did not spare her young daughter. What he did to them shocked even experienced detectives. The police photographer who arrived on the scene could not return to work for several months because of the shock of what he saw. Remarkably, the same profiler who had been brought in to investigate Rachel's murder worked on all of these cases, and he believed that all of these attacks had nothing to do with each other. The detectives also saw no possible connection to Rachel's case because they were 100% sure that Colin Stay was guilty. The team of investigators handling the attack at Crystal Palace Park also saw no connection. Napper was nearly 190 centimeters tall, and based on witness testimony, the perpetrator was shorter. But the maniac made one mistake in the attack on Samantha Bissett. He left a fingerprint in her apartment that allowed his identity to be run through the database. Napper had previously been fingerprinted after he stalked a woman in the street. He was not arrested until May 1994. When questioned, he denied guilt and was extremely calm in his apartment. They found maps of London on which the locations of the attacks and murders were circled, including the place where Rachel was murdered. They also found several notes on how to properly abuse women. Shortly before that, police found a knife in the very park where Rachel has murdered. The fingerprints on the handle matched Napper's, but even that wasn't enough to make detectives consider him the killer because they were still convinced Colin Stegg was guilty. Napper, however, was still considered a suspect in Rachel's murder for a while, but those charges were quickly dropped. The thing is that Napper said he was at work that day in 1995. Napper went on trial for the murder of Samantha and her daughter. The prosecution struck a deal with him in which he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and the court sent him to a closed psychiatric hospital instead of the prison. The fact was that Napper had been diagnosed with a number of disorders, including Asperger's syndrome and schizophrenia. Because of this, the maniac could have avoided prison anyway, with or without a confession. As a result, the judge sent him to provide a psychiatric hospital for treatment with no time limit. Later, detectives wanted to question him about Rachel's murder, but the doctors forbade it because they feared it might aggravate the Napper's mental status. Back to 2004, the new team of detectives on the Rachel Nichol case finally began to take a closer look at Napper as a suspect after they compared his DNA to a small sample found on the young woman's body. The results were very mixed. That sample wasn't enough to confirm the similarity. It was only enough to rule out other suspects in Napper's case. The results did not do with 100% certainty. Investigators kept digging further. Using new technology on Rachel's clothing, they managed to spot a microscopic piece of paint. Experts examined it and concluded that it matched the paint on the Napper's iron toolbox. Prior to his arrest, He worked as a storekeeper for the Department of Defense. It is not entirely clear how we could have gotten a job there with his set of mental disorders, but the fact remains he combined assault and murder with his day job. It took Scotland Yard 3 years to prepare this case for trial, and in 2007, Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. During the first hearing, he pleaded not guilty, which prolonged the trial for almost a year. At the end, Napper agreed the same deal he had been offered 12 years earlier, a change of plea to manslaughter in exchange for a confession on December 18, 2008. 16 years after the murder, he finally confessed. For Napper himself, the verdict did not change anything. He was left in the same hospital, under heavy guard. Most likely he will never be released. But the news made a lot of noise all over Britain. The police suffered it the most, fixating on Colin Stagg and completely ignoring Colin Stagg and other serious leads. Instead, the investigation was divided into 3 separate lines. Each team of detectives looked for different criminals, while behind all the attacks and murders was Napper. That the same year, 2008, Stagg sued the police department for £706,000, a record for Britain for unwarranted criminal prosecutions. The Metropolitan Police also issued a public apology to him. He subsequently wrote several books about his life experiences. In them, he described what it was like to be accused of murder. Stagg admitted that for 10 years, his life was effectively ruined by journalists and the police. After the whole of Britain finally believed in his innocence, he decided to spend all the compensation on travel, expensive cars, and other things that brought him joy. In 2010, a special commission issued a report criticizing the actions of homicide detectives. This document was called a catalogue of wrong decisions and mistakes, and the reason for this is not only the fact that the murder could not be solved for 16 years. The whole point is that if the police had done their job properly, they could have arrested Napper before he killed Rachel, Samantha, and her daughter. No disciplinary action followed. However, all of the detectives involved in the case retired, and one of the lead investigators passed away. As for Rachel's son, Alexei did not give his first interview until 2017, 25 years after the incident. He said that growing up without his mother had been problematic, but that he had found the strength to let go and move on. Shortly before the interview, he went to the very place where his mother was murdered, and at the moment, he was able to finally let go of the heavy weight of the past. One can only hope that this story, like others like it, will serve as a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. It is too late to speculate about whether or not the police could have saved Rachel and Samantha, but it is never too late to draw conclusions and prevent future crimes. Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. During a fire, a 19-year-old student was discovered dead in her own apartment. But the fire was not the cause of her death at all. The detective realized right away that they were dealing with a murder, but there was little to no evidence to support their suspicions. The police have many suspects, but only one tiny, seemingly insignificant detail helped them solve the case. Missy Gruba was born on April 26, 1974 in the American city of Burleson, Texas. Because of her family's humble lifestyle, she worked a variety of part-time jobs during her school year to help pay for her own schooling. Missy decided that she wanted to be a teacher even before graduating, and in 1992, she enrolled at the University of Texas at Arlington, which was about 40 kilometers from her home. Missy also decided to rent a place closer to campus and work 2 jobs to pay her rent and tuition without the help of her parents. But sometimes even that wasn't enough to cover a bill. In addition, she received good grades and participated actively in the local church even before graduation. Despite having a busy schedule, Missy called her mother every day when she got home. It had become a tradition for them that their daughter would call her and let her know that she had returned from work, even if it was already night. On the evening of April 7, 1994, Missy also called her mother. They spoke for about 10 hours. The young woman was in the middle of her senior year of high school. Around 3 a.m., Missy's downstairs neighbor called the police to report hearing loud noises coming from the apartment upstairs, including breaking glass and banging. Thinking there might have been a robbery going on, she called the police. The squad arrived on the scene, and a short time later, the fire department received a call to the same address. It turned out that there had been a fire. Since the building was small, the firefighters were able to locate the source of the fire, which was Missy's apartment on the second floor. When the firefighters entered the apartment, they saw a terrible sight. The young woman was lying on the bed with no clothes on, and the fire was raging all around her. The firefighters immediately realized she was dead so as to evacuate the residence. When the firefighters first arrived at the young woman's apartment, they smelled a strong gasoline odor. After thoroughly inspecting the apartment, the firefighters were confident that they were dealing with intentional arson. Someone had stabbed the young woman several times, leaving numerous bloody wounds on the bed. As for the fire itself, the firefighters immediately believed that it was purposeful arson, as well as when they first arrived at her apartment they smelled a strong gasoline odor. Dead young woman inside, but the arsonist had shut the front door, reducing the size of the fire and making it difficult for the flames to continue to burn. The police quickly identified the deceased as Missy Gruba, and while her body was handed over to the medical examiners, they came to the conclusion that she had passed away before the fire began. This was supported by the stab wounds on her body and the absence of smoke. They also discovered that the girl had been abused and were able to obtain a sample of the abuser's DNA as a result. The police discovered a knife in Missy's apartment that they believed to be the murder weapon, but there were no prints on it, and it appeared the killer had washed it in the sink before setting it on fire. The DNA sample from the victim's body was also ineffective. The police had their first lead almost immediately because it turned out that Missy had filed a police report on a coworker she had worked with at the coffee shop. A young guy had lost his place and was looking for someone to stay with for a while until he could find a new apartment of all his coworkers. Missy was the only one who agreed to help and let him stay with him regardless of her. The coworker only stayed there for a few days. One day, Missy returned from work and was about to deposit the day's tips into her piggy bank. She continued to set aside small sums to supplement her tuition and rent until she had nearly $1,000 saved up. However, that day, the young woman discovered that all of her money had vanished. Since no one else had spare keys, she immediately accused her coworker. He denied wrongdoing, but Missy insisted. When the young woman went to the police, the man may have harbored resentment toward her and decided to exact revenge. If he hadn't known that Missy had already done so, he might have killed her just to prevent her from doing it. The police began looking for this man. He had quit his job and vanished, so the investigators had a pretty good suspect. The man had the keys to Mrs. apartment, so he had no trouble getting in. The letters were found in the victim's apartment, and judging from their contents, he and Missy were having some sort of relationship. They didn't live too far apart, but they frequently wrote to and from each other. The young woman was a devout Christian who had never had a boyfriend. She also mentioned in her letters that she wouldn't be ready for an intimate relationship until she was married. Her companion initially shared this viewpoint, but over time the letter's contents grew more explicit. The detectives were pleased with their discovery and decided to run the man through the database. To their surprise, they learned that he had a prior conviction for violent crimes. Given that Missy had also been seen before the murder, this was enough to make the young man a suspect. He was found and questioned, but he denied any involvement and had no good alibi. The boy claimed he was sleeping alone in his house when Missy was killed, but Missy was killed between midnight and 3 in the morning. So his claim had a third suspect. The management of the cafe where Missy worked told them about an incident that occurred just before her death. The young woman reported to the manager that one of her coworkers, Jeff, had stolen some items or money from the cash register. The theft charges were confirmed and the man was fired afterwards. He later caught up with Missy and started accusing her of losing his job and leaving him without a livelihood. During this conversation, he said he was going to kill himself. During all of this was more than enough for the police to question the man. But while the detectives were attempting to learn his address, something unexpected occurred. Jeff's girlfriend entered the station and claimed she was afraid of her boyfriend and suspected him of killing Missy. It turned out that the man had not been home the night of the murder and he had never been there before. When he was found and brought in for questioning, Jeff acted very brazen and kept smiling. He bombarded the detectives with various stories that were inconsistent with reality, claiming that Missy was actually obsessed with him and wanted to date him, and that was why his behavior was so bad. The man repeatedly mentioned the story that he had been fired because of a complaint from Missy, and he had been furious about what she had done. When the detective said that Jeff's girlfriend denied this alibi and that he was at home with her the night of the murder, he just laughed and said that Jeff did agree to provide his DNA sample voluntarily, given that there was no evidence against him and the DNA analysis could have taken over a month. However, a few days later, Jeff's girlfriend called the police, upset, and reported that the man had kidnapped her. He held her hostage for 8 hours, threatening to kill her if she tried to flee. Eventually, he released her, and the young woman immediately called the police. They started looking for Jeff right away, but he had already escaped. Despite this, the detectives were almost certain that he was responsible for Missy's murder. They put out a search for him on a kidnapping charge, but the man seemed to have vanished. Meanwhile, experts at the lab were able to almost certain that Jeff was the murderer, but the lab's results disproved the theory. As a result, they were left with only one suspect who had not provided his DNA sample and who had not yet been found. A colleague of the victim who she had allowed to stay with her, but a month had passed since the murder, and the police were shocked to learn that both samples from Jeff and Missy's boyfriend had a different blood type. As mentioned earlier, Missy occasionally worked as a nanny. One of her regular clients was a young couple who lived in the same complex. They had a young child and the woman was pregnant with her second or partners. Missy's mother called the investigators and said she remembered a strange detail the young woman had told her on the phone a few days before she died. She didn't give it much thought and didn't decide to share with the police until a month later. According to the mother's account, a few days before her daughter's death, a man came to Missy's house to talk. Even though it was getting close to nightfall, she let him in. Lewis told her that his relationship with the young woman had been strained recently and that he just needed someone to talk to, but what followed was something that struck the police as extremely strange. Missy said to her mother that after the chow, Lewis told her that he was going to. Detectives found it difficult to believe that a 32-year-old man and his father would visit a 19-year-old woman's home at midnight and then engage in a pillow fight. But according to Missy's account of the incident, that is exactly what happened in a conversation with her mother. Missy didn't give it much thought, but the police decided to check on the man and discovered that Lewis had no criminal history, had served in the army, and was a model employee at the restaurant. But Lewis said, "I hope they catch whoever killed and raped Missy as soon as possible." He later added that they might never find the offender because all the evidence was destroyed in the fire. The problem was that the police never revealed that the victim had been abused before she died. It wasn't in the newspapers or reports, and it wasn't mentioned in any interviews. The man was calm and forthright in his responses to all of the police inquiries until the detectives asked him for a DNA sample, at which point Lewis became visibly nervous and questioned why they needed his DNA since the fire was supposed to destroy all traces of the perpetrator and his sample would have nothing to compare it to. The man said that he and Missy did talk a lot, but that he had nothing to do with her murder. Lewis' behavior changed dramatically when the detectives told him they had a sample of the killer's DNA. He said he urgently needed to take his child somewhere and left the station, promising to return the next day to take the DNA test, but he never did. It is important to note that the police also withheld the fact that the experts received a sample of the killer's DNA, so no one knew whether they had this evidence or not. Man was no longer working there. The manager reported that the man's girlfriend had called and asked for Lewis to take a few days off because he had to leave town. Additionally, the detectives learned that Lewis had married his girlfriend the day after he was questioned. At this point, they could only speculate as to the motivation behind the marriage, but first they decided to speak with his wife, who revealed that Lewis had called her from work the day of the murder and announced that he was going to leave town. Lewis told his wife that he had run by Missy's house and noticed the fire. He went up to her apartment and saw that the place was engulfed in flames and the young woman herself was lying on the bed. Lewis tried to save her by giggling. He returned after 2 a.m. and his wife noticed that he smelled strongly of smoke and gasoline. The man was also coughing constantly and his nose had traces of soot. His wife asked him what had happened, forced him to run outside. Reportedly, his wife was pleased with the story, and they went to bed. As you have already realized, the detectives found a number of suspicious points in the story, even setting aside the fact that the man decided to go for a run in the middle of the night. His further story defies any sense of reason. First, how could he have gotten into Missy's apartment without keys after the fire? Forensics found no evidence of forced entry on the door. According to Lewis's account, he entered the victim's apartment after she had already passed away. Additionally, if his account is to be believed, Lewis decided to go to bed after witnessing the death of a young woman he had known for a year and a full-fledged fire in the home next door. His wife, it appears, did not feel the need to intervene either. The police also learned Lewis's blood type from his wife, and it matched the blood type found on the victim, sufficient to place a man on the wanted list. But his whereabouts remained unknown. The wife also claimed that she didn't know where her husband had gone, but the detectives didn't believe her by that point. Instead, they suspected that the woman was purposefully protecting Lewis because, in their opinion, he had given her a significantly altered account of the murder in which he had no choice, or Missy had attacked him herself. In other words, he had persuaded her under false pretense immediately after Lewis's wife gave them information about where he might be. Police from the city of San Antonio discovered a burnt-out car that belonged to Lewis and that his mother lived in the same city. Detectives went there and found the man, who was then arrested at the station. He acted extremely tense, lying on the floor sobbing, and generally looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. Lewis's story then turned genuinely bizarre when he said he didn't remember how events unfolded after that, but he may have stabbed her, while denying that he had set the apartment on fire. The man did not actually deny his involvement in setting the fire. This account did not go well with the fact that the young woman's body was found with many wounds and bruises, let alone the fire. Given that Lewis did not directly confess, the case went to trial, and the man continued to maintain that he and Missy had a consensual, intimate relationship that night. This made the detectives' job difficult, but now they could take a sample of his DNA at that point. They already knew that Lewis's blood type matched the killer's, and all they had to do was wait for the DNA results. Eventually, the experts found a perfect match, and Lewis was charged with murder. According to the investigation, Lewis claimed that he did not remember stabbing Missy but did remember getting a knife from the kitchen. He also claimed that he remembered that there was a fire in the room but that he did not start it. Lewis had long had a crush on Missy and was even somewhat obsessed with her because of this one intriguing fact. He had lived in her condominium and worked in the same restaurant as her for almost a year. In addition, in the days prior to the murder, Lewis had visited Missy around midnight for no apparent reason, which also seemed odd to the investigators. According to their version, Lewis had gone to her apartment on the night of the murder in order to persuade Missy to have intimate contact with the young woman who was the victim of the murder. There were hundreds of similar complexes in their city, so it would be logical to assume that Lewis had chosen this particular place in order to live closer to Missy. Possibly the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy came about only after investigators began to suspect Lewis and informed him that the fire had not destroyed the killer's DNA. Upon learning this, Lewis could have persuaded his wife to believe the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy. He and Lewis flew into a rage. He abused her, then killed her, and went to get gasoline after setting the apartment on fire. He returned home and told his wife some made-up story in which detectives theorized that Lewis had married her only so she would be legally entitled to not testify against him. As for Lewis himself, the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of petitioning for parole in 2034. However, aside from the young woman receiving CPR, it appears that his wife really didn't know the truth. She was also not charged in any way. The court determined that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out: to kill Missy to avoid prison. As a result, the court concluded that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out: to kill Missy to avoid prison. The police were able to solve a very complicated case in which the most improbable was the culprit they only attracted attention to. Lewis may have gotten away with it if it weren't for that small detail. and Jeff was eventually apprehended and sentenced to 4 years in prison for kidnapping his own girlfriend. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like if you liked the video. Thanks for watching.